Wow, this is heavy stuff. Diving into these BBC reports on that plane crash in South Korea, it's like, I don't know, almost surreal.
Yeah, it really grabs you, doesn't it? Like watching a disaster movie, but knowing it's all too real.
Exactly. And we're going through it just as the world did back then, December 28th, 2024. Jeju Air Flight 7C-2216.
A Boeing 737-800 coming in from Bangkok crashed on landing at Muan International Airport.
The early reports are just fragmented. Breaking news flashes, confusion everywhere.
Total chaos. It really shows you how fragile things are, how quickly everything can change.
And the eyewitness footage, smoke pouring from the runway, you immediately feel the intensity of the panic.
It's a stark reminder, right, that even routine things like landing a plane can turn disastrous in a heartbeat. And this wasn't just any plane, a 737, a workhorse of the industry.
Global impact right there. So as the day went on, the death toll, it just kept climbing.
Tragic, those early estimates. They always seem to underestimate the reality when rescue workers finally get to the wreckage.
Behind those numbers are real people. Families, lives changed forever.
Yeah, the human cost is always the hardest part to process.
The scene at the crash site, from the reports, firefighters battling the flames, the plane, totally mangled. Devastating.
And then you have acting President Choi Sang-mok arriving amidst all this.
Well, the country's already in a political crisis, mind you. Speaks volumes about the gravity of the situation.
Absolutely. Now, Jeju Air, they're South Korea's top budget airline, known for their network all across Asia.
And their safety record's been pretty solid up until this point.
Makes it even more shocking. This was their first fatal crash in almost 20 years of operation.
Their response was immediate. Website went black, public apologies, and that image of CEO Kim Il-bae bowing his head at the press conference.
Powerful imagery. That bow, it's not just a gesture in South Korea. It's taking full responsibility.
A cultural weight behind it. So everyone wants answers, right? What caused this? Early on, there was talk of a bird strike, and the weather that day was pretty rough.
The fire chief at Muan, he was quoted saying those were likely factors, but he stressed the investigation was just starting.
Of course, those investigations are incredibly complex. It's not like they find one thing and that's it.
Right. It's like a giant puzzle with every little piece potentially crucial. The pressure must be immense.
Speaking of which, I think people hear black box and think it's simple. But those things record everything. Engine data, pilot conversations, even tiny vibrations.
A microscopic view of those final moments. So if it was a bird strike, they'd be looking for any trace, feathers, anything, plus how the weather affected the landing itself.
A lot to untangle. Now, all this is happening while South Korea is already on edge, politically speaking. The previous acting president was impeached, talk of martial law.
Yeah, a tense backdrop to this tragedy. Did it overshadow the political drama? Or did it offer some sort of, I don't know, unifying moment? Too early to say, I guess.
It adds another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation. And let's not forget the human cost. 124 confirmed deaths, according to the BBC. Only 2 surviving crew members, pulled from the tail section.
A stark reminder that every number represents a life lost, a family devastated.
We've only scratched the surface here. The chaos, the search for survivors, the initial attempts to figure out what went wrong.
So what are your initial thoughts? What questions are already popping up as we dig deeper into this Jeju Air crash? We're back, and, as we get further into this, I can't help but think about how this went way beyond South Korea.
Yeah, the impact was global. This Jeju Air crash, it made headlines everywhere.
Absolutely. International news, everyone was glued to it, trying to make sense of it all.
And because it was a Boeing 737-800, one of the most common planes out there, it makes you wonder.
Makes everyone nervous. If it can happen to a supposedly safe airline like Jeju, could it happen anywhere?
The BBC mentioned Boeing put out a statement, offering condolences and saying they'd help with the investigation.
Standard procedure, sure, but it shows you how one event ripples through the entire industry.
Speaking of the investigation, where do they even start? It's such a massive undertaking.
Oh, it's a huge collaboration. The South Korean Aviation and Railway Accident Investigation Board, they'd lead it, but they'd have help. Experts from Boeing, the U.S. NTSB, all working together.
So we're talking hundreds of people combing through the wreckage.
Definitely. Every single piece examined, the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, those black boxes, all analyzed meticulously.
Plus, interviews with everyone involved. Air traffic control, maintenance crews, even the surviving crew members.
A ton of data to process, trying to piece together what happened. Painstaking work.
The BBC reports didn't have any concrete findings yet, but they did mention what the fire chief at Muin initially thought.
Right, the bird strike and bad weather, but those were preliminary ideas, not final conclusions. A proper investigation, it takes time, could be months, even years.
Yeah, it's tempting to want answers right away, but rushing things can actually hurt the process.
Absolutely. Got to be patient. Now, let's go back to what was happening in South Korea at the time, politically speaking. Remember, it was already a tense situation.
Right. The previous acting president had just been impeached, there were talks of martial law, and then, boom, this crash.
And acting president Choi Sang-mok, he went straight to the crash site. Shows you how seriously they took it.
But did it maybe take some heat off the political stuff? Or did it make things even more tense?
Hard to say for sure. Maybe it offered a brief moment of unity, everyone focused on the tragedy. Or maybe it just added fuel to the fire, with different sides using it to push their own agendas.
A fascinating dynamic to think about, how a national tragedy interacts with an already volatile political situation.
Absolutely. The BBC also mentioned those 2 crew members who survived, the ones pulled from the tail section.
I can't imagine what they went through.
And their testimony, if they were able to give any, would have been crucial to the investigation. Their firsthand account of those final moments, it could fill in a lot of blanks.
But the pressure on them must have been immense. To be the only survivors, to relive that trauma, to help the investigation.
It's a heavy burden, but it also speaks to human resilience. Even in the face of something so horrific, there's this urge to understand, to find meaning.
So we've covered the global reaction, the complexity of the investigation, the potential political fallout within South Korea.
As we head into the final part of this deep dive, I want you to think about this. What does this crash mean for the future of aviation? Not just in South Korea, but worldwide. How will it affect policies, regulations, even our own feelings about flying?
Okay, we're back for the last part of our deep dive. And I think it's time to really think about what comes next. The aftermath, the long road to recovery.
Yeah, we've talked about the immediate impact, the investigation, the shock around the world, but what does it all mean in the long run? What changes for aviation, for South Korea, for the families who lost so much?
Well, the BBC reports mentioned that acting president Choi Sang-mok declared Muan a special disaster zone, right where the crash happened. What does that even mean, practically speaking?
It's a big deal. It basically frees up a ton of government resources, money, manpower, everything, and directs it to where it's needed most, helping the victims' families, supporting the recovery effort.
So it's not just about figuring out why it happened, but also dealing with the consequences.
Exactly. And that support goes beyond just money. There's counseling for grieving families, medical care for anyone who survived, even help with all the logistics.
Logistically, I bet it's overwhelming. Identifying remains, dealing with insurance, all that.
It's a huge task. And the scale of it shows just how deeply this tragedy affected South Korea.
Now, zooming out a bit, anytime there's a major crash like this, the whole aviation industry has to take a hard look at itself.
Right, it forces everyone to re-examine safety procedures, look for ways to improve.
The BBC didn't give specifics, but I'm sure whatever the investigation finds will lead to a whole bunch of recommendations, maybe changes in regulations, pilot training, even how planes are designed.
That's what you hope for, that something good can come out of something so terrible.
Yeah.
That we can learn from it and make flying safer for everyone.
It's like this constant push and pull, right, between innovation and making sure things are as safe as possible.
Absolutely. And what about Jeju Air? They had a good reputation, but this must have shaken things up.
I mean, they apologized, said they'd do everything they could to help the families. But regaining trust after something like this, that's not easy.
It's a long road back. Makes you think about how companies handle crises like this, especially in an industry where safety is everything. One mistake can have consequences that last for years.
Definitely. Now, bringing it back to the political situation in South Korea at the time, remember, things were already pretty tense.
Right, on a knife's edge. Did this crash somehow bring people together, or did it just make things worse?
It's probably a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, in times of tragedy, you see people supporting each other, finding common ground. But those deep political divisions, they don't just disappear.
Yeah, and you can bet that some people tried to use the situation for their own gain, to push their agenda or attack their opponents. It's a sad reality of politics, even when something this awful happens.
It shows you that even amidst a national tragedy, the political machine keeps on going. But at the end of the day, we have to come back to the human cost. 124 lives lost, families shattered.
Those aren't just numbers on a page. Each one represents a person, with dreams, with loved ones. And the BBC reports they only give us a tiny glimpse of the grief and the loss that this crash caused.
It's easy to get caught up in the technical details, the investigation, the politics of it all. But what we can't forget are the people. Their lives were changed forever.
And those stories, those individual experiences, those are what really stick with us. They help us understand what happened and what it all means. I encourage everyone listening, go find those stories, hear the voices of those who were affected, and let's all work towards a future where tragedies like this don't happen again.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The immediate aftermath, the search for answers, what it means for aviation, for South Korea, for all of us. But it doesn't end here.
We hope this has made you curious, made you think. Keep exploring this event, find those human stories, and consider what lessons we can learn from this Jeju air crash. Thanks for joining us.